There are places that do not disappear when they close. They change state. Pennhurst State School and Hospital was officially closed in 1987. The population was relocated, the routines ended, and the doors were locked. For a brief moment, it seemed the story had concluded. But history rarely ends when paperwork does. Because closure does not remove meaning, it only removes function. And what remains begins to change into something else entirely. After closure, Pennhurst entered a period without definition, not yet preserved, not yet interpreted, not yet forgotten, just empty. Buildings once designed for thousands stood without purpose. Maintenance, already lacking, stopped, and weather began its work immediately. Paint peeled and floors shifted. Corridors filled with silence had no institutional schedule to contain it. And what had once been a system became vacancy. And vacancy in a place like this is never neutral. It becomes narrative, it becomes argument, and it becomes ownership. But vacancy does not automatically become meaning. In the earliest years, it often becomes nothing at all. No interpretation, no attention, only neglect moving slowly without an audience. Most abandoned institutions do not begin as stories. They begin as administrative afterthoughts left outside public view. And what feels like narrative formation in hindsight may, at the time, have been simple disappearance. Vacancy is not always a stage. Sometimes it is just absence without witness. Vacancy does not become narrative. It becomes classification drift. A property record remains active even when the building does not. It is still accounted for, still zoned, still insured, and still legally present. But none of those systems require interpretation. They only require status. And in that state, a place does not become meaningful or meaningless. It becomes administratively suspended. Present in records, but absent in attention.
These are some of the sights and sounds of Pennhurst, the state institution for the mentally retarded. It's located in Spring City, Chester County. In 1908, when the institution first opened, the man in charge bitterly complained to the state that the conditions were already overcrowded. He transferred many of the patients to Q1, a classroom building. Many of them are still there.
At one time, Pennhurst was revealed to the public as a functioning institution. Now, it was returning to the public as something else. A memory being replayed. But memory does not remain fixed either. It begins to shift depending on who's looking. But what is being replayed is not the place itself. It is documentation, fragments, and selected exposure. A mediated version of institutional life, shaped by what could be filmed, recorded, or broadcast. What is seen is not totality, but partial visibility presented as understanding. In the years that followed, Pennhurst re-entered public space, not as an institution, but as interpretation. Visitors came for different reasons. Some came to learn, some came to document, some came simply to stand inside it, and in doing so, they changed what the place was. The same corridors that once carried institutional routine now carried meaning assigned from the outside. History was no longer contained within the building, it was being negotiated within it. But interpretation carries a cost, because buildings like this do not remain standing through memory alone. They require stabilization, restoration, oversight, and funding. And at some point, every conversation about preservation becomes a conversation about survival. Survival is never abstract, it is financial. As former Pennhurst business manager Elmer McSurdy observed,
"Can't touch a building unless you're ready to spend $1 million or $1.5 million.
But memory does not reliably produce funding, and attention does not always convert into preservation. A place can be widely known and still structurally collapse. It can be interpreted, visited, photographed, and still remain financially unreachable. And in that gap between meaning and money, interpretation can become a substitute for action rather than a pathway to it. Because awareness does not pay for roofs, and historical significance does not stabilize masonry. In the end, memory may assign value, but value alone does not determine survival. Only funding does. McSurdy's statement was not theoretical, it was and is structural reality. Because preservation is not only about meaning, it is about what meaning costs to maintain. Over time, Pennhurst became part of a broader cultural circuit. Historical tours, paranormal investigations, media production, and educational visits. Each approach different, each interpretation distinct. Some framed it as history, some framed it as experience, some framed it as something in between. And in that overlap, Pennhurst became contested. Not physically, but narratively. Because once a place is interpreted publicly, it no longer belongs to a single story. It becomes shared, and sometimes it becomes divided. But division is not always the result of interpretation. Sometimes interpretation simply reveals divisions that already existed. Different audiences do not transform a site so much as project themselves onto it. And what appears as fragmentation may actually be parallel experience occurring without contradiction. A place can hold multiple meanings without being in conflict. It can be educational, commercial, commemorative, simultaneously without any single version displacing the others.
We have found of late that it is quite effective to downgrade him a little bit and put him on a log cottage with autistic type children or hyperactive children, a classification that used to be called low grades or that sort of thing, and it offends their dignity somewhat. They don't like it.
Inside the institution, authority once defined meaning. Doctors interpreted behavior, administrators defined structure, and policy defined necessity. What once justified confinement is now what must be interpreted by history. That shift is not just cultural, it is moral. But moral interpretation is retrospect by design. It imposes present understating onto past systems that operated under different constraints, languages, and assumptions. What appears as moral clarity today may obscure the internal logic that governed decisions at the time. Not to excuse them, but to explain that they were not just made in a moral vacuum, even if they are judged within one now. But interpretation is not freely generated at the site itself. It is pre-shaped before arrival. Visitors do not encounter Pennhurst as a neutral field of meaning. They arrive already segmented by media genre, by expectation, and by institutional framing. Historical tourism, paranormal tourism, educational access, and media production do not overlap randomly. They are pre-built channels that direct experience before it occurs. What appears as plurality is often distribution. Different audiences are not creating meanings in the same space. They are entering different versions of the space that were already prepared for them. But interpretation is not the only force acting on Pennhurst today. There is another, one that does not deal in memory, but in utility. In recent years, proposals have been introduced to redevelop portions of the Pennhurst property into large-scale data infrastructure. On paper, it is redevelopment, a reuse of land shaped by existing infrastructure corridors, but it also introduces a new question. What happens when a place defined by institutional confinement becomes infrastructure for another kind of system? Each proposed future for Pennhurst carries a different definition of value. Preservation assigns value to memory, tourism assigns value to experience, and infrastructure assigns value to function. But these categories are not mutually exclusive in practice. Infrastructure sites can coexist with historical landscapes. Preservation and redevelopment are often negotiated together, not in opposition, and function does not erase history automatically. It overlays it, sometimes invisibly, sometimes with acknowledgement, and sometimes with compromise. Even data infrastructure does not operate in a vacuum. It is subject to zoning, regulation, public review, and sometimes preservation constraints. What appears as replacement is often negotiation. All exist on the same ground, competing for the same space. Pennhurst no longer exists in a single form. It exists as history, as memory, as interpretation, and as proposal. It is no longer what it was, but it has not stopped becoming something new. And in that condition, it remains unsettled, because every attempt to define it produces a different version of the same place. Preserved, interpreted, repurposed, or replaced. And beneath all of it, the same question remains, not about what Pennhurst was, but what it must become in order to continue existing at all. And who, finally, gets to decide that?